You are invited to participate in our transportation planning process, regardless of your race, color, national origin, including limited English proficiency, religion, creed, gender, ancestry, ethnicity, disability, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, veteran status, or background. You can read the full notice of your rights and protections at www.boston-MPO.org/MPO_DISCRIMINATION. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, or if you have any technical difficulties, please contact Erin McGuire of the MPO staff at emaguire@ctps.org or 857-702-3681 or via the chat box. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation. After roll call, board members may mute and unmute themselves. Always remain muted unless actively speaking. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. Find this by clicking either on the participants button, bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with a raise hand button at the bottom, or the reactions button in the toolbar. The chair will then call on participants. If you're on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. Welcome everyone to a meeting of the Boston Metropolitan Region Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization. I'm David Moeller. I represent Secretary Monica Tibbetts-Nutt here. Please call the roll.
Okay. MassDOT seat 1. MassDOT seat 2.
Hello, it's Tracy Lenhart in for John Bouchard today for seat 2.
MassDOT Highway Division.
John Romano, MassDOT Highway Division here.
MBTA.
Good morning, Sandy Johnson, representing General Manager Phil Lang in the MBTA.
Regional Transportation Authorities, Metro West Regional Transit Authority.
Good morning, this is Tyler Tarasi, representing Administrator Jim Nee for the Metro West Regional Transit Authority. Present.
Massport.
Hello, good morning. This is Sarah Lee representing Massport.
MAPC.
Good morning, Eric Barrasso with MAPC.
MBTA Advisory Board.
Good morning, Hannah Switlikowski, MBTA Advisory Board.
Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Leonard Diggins, RTAC Chair here.
City of Boston, seat 1.
Representing Mayor Michelle Wu in the City of Boston.
City of Boston, seat 2. City of Everett.
Morning, Jay Monty, representing Mayor DiMaria in the City of Everett.
City of Newton.
David Kozis, representing Mayor Ruth Ann Fuller in the City of Newton.
Town of Arlington.
John Alessi, representing Select Board Chair Steve DeCourcy in the Town of Arlington.
Town of Brookline.
Good morning, Erin Chute, representing Select Board Chair Bernard Green, Town of Brookline.
Intercore Committee. Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, Town of Acton.
Good morning, Keila Sauer, representing Fran Arsenal, Chair of the Acton Select Board.
Yeah.
Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham. North Shore Task Force, City of Beverly.
Darlene Nguyen, representing the North Shore Task Force and Mayor Cahill of Beverly.
North Suburban Planning Council, Town of Burlington. South Shore Coalition, Town of Hull. Southwest Advisory Planning Committee, Town of Rentham. Three Rivers Interlocal Council, Town of Norwood.
Good morning, Tom O'Rourke from the town of Norwood, representing the Trick subregion.
Federal Highway Administration.
Ken Miller, Federal Highway. Good morning.
And Federal Transit Administration. Okay, that's the roll. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is the chair's report, and I do not have one today, so we will go directly to the executive director's report, which will be given by Annette Dimcher today because Tegan's out. Annette, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everyone. Next slide, please. Today, I have one announcement, after which I'll share today's agenda and then talk about our next meeting dates. Next slide, please. As Tegan mentioned at our last meeting, many of our meetings are going to be longer going through April than the usual 2 hours to accommodate the upcoming TIP discussions. And we are also planning to hold the March 20th and April 3rd meetings, which are centered largely on TIP scenario discussions in person at 10 Park Plaza. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So today's agenda includes 4 action items and 2 update presentations. We'll start with Sam Taylor presenting the transit safety performance targets that MPOs and RTAs are required to adopt each year. This particular set of targets, if adopted, fulfills one part of the MPO's annual PM1 target requirements, and those are the safety requirements. You approved the other part, the roadway safety performance targets, at the last MPO meeting. Next, Ethan Lapointe will present and ask you to endorse 2 amendments to the federal fiscal years 2025 through 2029 TIP. These amendments were presented to you in January. Amendment 7 includes the EPA grants for EV school bus procurements in Boston, Hingham, and Hamilton Wenham school districts. And Amendment 8 includes the 4 federal fiscal year 2025 earmarked discretionary grants and 1 statewide highway project cost change. Following Ethan, Olivia Sacaccio will present Amendment 2 to the federal fiscal year 2025 UPWP, which adds 8 discretionary grants. And then Ethan Lapointe will return to provide updated project readiness information for those projects to be considered for funding in the federal fiscal years 2026 through 2030 TIP. And finally, Chris Clem and Derek Cravat from MassDOT will provide an update about the financial information disseminated at the Massachusetts Association of Regional Planning Agencies annual meeting. They bring this forth each year. It includes the statewide federal funding for the upcoming federal fiscal year and the distribution based on federal guidance and statewide priorities. Next slide, please. So our next 2 meetings will be held on March 6th and March 20th. The March 6th meeting will be a virtual meeting. And then the March 20th meeting will be the first of the 2 in-person hybrid meetings that I mentioned earlier, held at 10 Park Plaza. And with that, I turn it back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any questions for Annette? Seeing none, next item on our agenda is public comments. Are there any comments from the public at this time? Seeing and hearing none, if you have a comment during the meeting, please raise your hand and we will try to call on you. Next item is committee chairs reports. Are there any? Jen Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The TIP Process Engagement and Readiness Committee met last Thursday, February 13th at 1. We reviewed the initial readiness scenario and how it reflects updates from MassDOT's readiness days, including some projects that are flagged for risk or recommended for delay. Ethan's going to present this readiness scenario to the full board today. The committee also took a look at new project applications, which have rebounded, and then finally began discussing near and long-term implications for the regional target program, how we might address them. This is a conversation that I'd expect to continue today and at subsequent committee meetings, the next of which is scheduled for March 13th at 1. That's all I had.
Thank you, Jen. Any questions for Jen? Seeing none, Chris Clem.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everyone. This is Chris Clem from MassDOT's Office of Transportation Planning. The UPWP committee met last on Thursday, February 6th. At that meeting, the committee voted to recommend that this body endorse amendment number 2 to the federal fiscal year 2025 Unified Planning Work Program. That amendment adds 8 discretionary grant awards to the appendix of that document for informational purposes as required by our federal partners. And this action does not need federal approval or a public comment period, which is in line with the amendment and administrative modification procedures stated in the FFY 2025 UPWP document. And so the request from the board later in the agenda will be to endorse that amendment today, and more details will come from Olivia later. And then further at that meeting, we also kicked off development of the FFY 2026 UPWP. Earlier this week, a survey was shared with the public soliciting input on the overall direction of the MPO's work, and board members should have received a survey yesterday requesting feedback on the MPO's ongoing work, as well as some discrete study ideas. And both of those surveys will close during the first week of March. And once staff have the opportunity to analyze the responses, the committee will meet again in early April to discuss the results. And that's what I have.
Thank you, Chris. Any questions for Chris? Seeing none. Next item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes of December 19th, 2024. Can I get a motion and a second to approve the minutes, please? And please state your name for the record when making the motion. Jen Rowe.
Motion to approve the minutes, and did just want to note that MPO staff, I sent MPO staff a couple of small edits to my committee report and Vinit's presentation. They were friendly and small. So with that, I would motion to approve the minutes.
Thank you. Eric?
Eric Barassa, I'll second that motion with Jen's updates.
Thank you. Motions have been made and seconded. Are there any comments, changes, questions, or suggestions other than the ones Jen has already provided? Seeing none, can you please call a roll on the motion?
Yes. David Moeller,
Yes.
Tracy Lendhart,
Yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Sandy Johnston,
Sandy Johnston, yes.
Tyler Terrasi,
Tyler Terrasi, yes.
Sarah Lee,
Sarah Lee, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Hannah Switlikowski,
Hannah Switlikowski, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Diggins, yes.
Jen Rowe,
Jen Rowe, yes.
Nayeli Rodriguez,
Nayeli Rodriguez, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kosis,
David Kozis, yes.
John Alessi,
John Alessi, yes.
Aaron Shute,
Aaron Shute, yes.
Kayla Sauer,
Kayla Sauer, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
And that motion carries.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is the transit safety performance targets. Sam Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hi, everyone. My name is Sam Taylor, excuse me, Program Manager of Performance-Based Planning and Programming, and I'm here to present to you the 2025 Transit Safety Performance Targets in accordance with the U.S. Department of Transportation's PM1 rules. Before we begin, I just want to thank all the transit agencies for their coordination on this agenda item. Next slide, please. So here's a brief overview of what this presentation will cover. I will give a short explanation of how the transit safety performance targets fit into the performance-based planning and programming process. I'll briefly describe the performance measures, as 7 of the 14 measures are new for 2025. Then I will cover the proposed targets submitted by MBTA, the Cape Ann Transportation Authority, or CATA, and the Metro West Regional Transit Authority, or MWRTA. We will discuss some opportunities and next steps related to transit safety programming, and then we will ask the board to take a vote on the proposed 2025 transit safety performance targets. Next slide, please. So many of you have seen this slide in a similar form recently, even just 2 weeks ago at the last MPO meeting. This is a reminder that we set transit safety targets annually. There are two other performance areas that are set annually, and those are roadway safety and transit asset conditions. And other performance areas that we're not required to address this year include bridge and pavement condition, travel time reliability, congestion mitigation, and air quality. Next slide, please. So the target setting process for this is fairly straightforward. The U.S. Department of Transportation establishes requirements on reporting, and the FTA's National Public Transit Safety Plan sets transit safety measures. Each transit agency produces a Public Transit Agency Safety Plan, or PTASP, and those include performance targets for safety measures. And then MPOs work with transit agencies to set regional targets on an annual basis. Next slide, please. So for 2025, there are 14 required performance measures on which MPOs must adopt safety targets. On the left side of the screen, there are the 7 repeating performance measures, meaning these are measures that we have adopted targets on in the past, and those are number of fatalities, fatality rate, number of injuries, injury rate, number of major events rate, and system reliability, or the mean distance between major mechanical failures. And then on the right side of the screen are the 7 new performance measures, and those are transit worker fatality rate, transit worker injury rate, assaults on transit workers, rate of assaults on transit workers, collision rates, pedestrian collision rates, and vehicular collision rates. And for all measures except for system reliability, the desired direction of progress is a decreasing value. Next slide, please. So just a few more key points before we get into each transit agency's proposed targets. Transit agencies must adopt targets each year, but submit full PTASPs on a triennial basis for review. Transit agencies and MPOs must set performance targets for these 14 safety measures. 7 of these are new for 2025, and while MPOs and transit agencies are required to set targets, FTA does not impose penalties for failure to meet those targets. Next slide, please. So we will start with MBTA. The next 4 slides will be on the MBTA. So the first one here is on fatalities and injuries for MBTA. For each performance measure and each mode, there is a column showing average performance from 2021 through 2023. And there's another column showing the corresponding 2025 performance target. MBTA has set targets of 0 for fatalities on all its modes. And for the remaining targets, MBTA has set targets that are 2% lower than the average performance between 2021 and 2023. As a reminder, the goal for all of these measures is a reduction, and all rates are being expressed as being per 1 million vehicle revenue miles, or VRM. Next slide, please. So new in 2025 are 4 measures related to transit worker safety. And those are transit worker fatality rate, transit worker injury rate, number of assaults on transit workers, and rates of assaults on transit workers. MBTA has set their fatality rate target here to 0, and for the most part, for the injury rate and the assault rate, MBTA has established targets that are 2% lower than the average performance from 2021 to 2023. The one exception is the RIDE, which is paratransit service, which held its target on injury rates and assault rates for transit workers at the same rate as its past performance. Next slide, please. In addition, collision-related measures are new in 2025. These performance measures include overall collision rates per 1 million VRM, and also pedestrian collision rates and vehicular collision rates. For all modes except for the RIDE, MBTA established targets that are 2% lower than the average performance from 2021 to 2023. Next slide, please. And finally, we have MBTA targets on safety events and system reliability. Safety events are non-security related events that are reported by transit agencies, and system reliability is a measure of the mean number of miles between mechanical failures. So the average distance each mode of service travels before a breakdown. System reliability is the one measure with a desired increase in values. And for all modes, MBTA has proposed targets on safety events and system reliability that aim for a 2% improvement over average performance from 2021 to 2023. Just wanted to note one thing, the column, which is the past performance on average system reliability, which is the 5th out of 6 columns. That data is unavailable, but the target for such is in the next column over. So next slide, please. We will move on to CADA. CADA has submitted targets for fatalities, fatality rate, injuries, and injury rate here. And with no reportable fatalities or injuries in the past 5 years on both its fixed route and demand response services, CADA has set all of its fatality and injury targets to 0 for 2025. Next slide, please. Similarly, CADA has submitted targets for measures related to transit worker safety, and with no reportable fatalities, injuries, or assaults on transit workers in the past 5 years on both its fixed route and demand response services, CADA has set all of its transit worker related safety targets to 0. Next slide, please. On collision related measures, CADA is aiming for some reductions. Both modes of service had similar average rates of collisions over the past 5 years at 2.36 and 2.41 collisions per 100,000 vehicle revenue miles for fixed route and demand response services, respectively. And for both modes of service, CADA has set a target of 2 collisions per 100,000 vehicle revenue miles. I should note that pedestrian collisions and vehicular collisions are subsets of the average collision total. And so CADA anticipates that the collisions would occur involving vehicles and not pedestrians. Next slide, please. CADA has fairly similar rates of safety events and system reliability performance for its 2 modes of service. CADA has proposed targets of 0.5 safety events per 100,000 VRM for both of its modes of services, which is a modest reduction from its 5-year averages. And for system reliability, CADA set targets that anticipate fewer miles between failures for fixed route service and an increase in miles between failures for demand response service, which of course is an improvement for demand response. Next slide, please. And then finally, we have MWRTA's performance targets. MWRTA has set their fatalities and fatality rate targets at 0 and their injury rate targets at less than 1 injury per 100,000 VRMs. And as MWRTA has done for a couple of years in a row now, they have set injury-related targets that are more relaxed than recent performance will show. However, these targets have been decreasing over time. For example, the last year's fixed route injury target was 0.8, and last year's demand response target was 1. And of course, those numbers are lower for this year. Next slide, please. Like MBTA and CADA, MWRTA is setting transit worker safety-related targets for the first time in 2021. MWRTA has had no reported transit worker fatalities or assaults on transit workers in the past 5 years, and just 1 transit worker injury in that time. And while targets for 2025 are not 0 for transit worker injuries or assaults, MWRTA has set these targets in accordance with a policy of encouraging drivers to report incidents of this nature. Next slide, please. Additionally, MWRTA has set targets on collision-related measures for the first time this year. MWRTA has set overall collision target rates at 0.53 and 0.6 collisions per 100,000 VRMs for fixed route and demand response services, respectively. Again, the pedestrian collision rate targets and the vehicular collision rate targets are subsets of the overall collision rate. So when you add those 2 subsets together, they equal the overall collision rate. And MWRTA has set these targets anticipating greater rates of vehicular collisions than pedestrian-related collisions for both modes of service. Next slide, please. Now we have the fourth and final performance area for MWRTA, which is safety events and system reliability. MWRTA set safety event rate targets of 0.8 and 0.7 events per 100,000 VRMs for fixed route and demand response services, respectively. Similar to their injury targets, while these targets will appear to account for more safety events than have occurred in the past 5 years, the proposed safety event target is lower than those were adopted in 2024. And for system reliability, MWRTA has put forward a target of 75,000 miles between failures for both modes of service. And that number is equal to its 2024 targets. Next slide, please. So related to target setting, there are a few ways that states, MPOs, and RTAs apply these targets. Regional transit agencies create safety management systems, or SMS, as part of their safety plans. MassDOT's capital improvement plan allocates federal dollars to CIP programs that support MBTA and RTA asset improvement, which helps improve safety outcomes. And the Boston Region MPO considers transit agency investments when they apply for the inclusion in the 2026 to 2030 TIP. In the current TIP, there are 4 projects that are aimed at transit safety. And these examples include the Jackson Square accessibility improvements, the Reading Station and Wilbur interlocking track upgrade project, phase 2 of the Columbus Ave bus lane project, and the procurement of new buses for the Metro West RTA. Next slide, please. So I thank you all for your attention today. I know I didn't verbally touch on every single number that was on those slides since there were so many, but I just wanted to acknowledge that. But yes, MPO staff would like to request that the board vote to adopt the calendar year 2025 transit safety performance targets as presented today. I will turn it back over to you, Mr. Chair.
Seeing and hearing none, can you get a motion and a second to adopt the calendar year 2025 transit safety targets as presented today? Lynn Diggins.
Actually, I didn't hear you asking me for questions, so can I just ask me maybe 1 or 2 questions? All right.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. And I guess the first is just going to be an invitation to you, Sam, and also to maybe Sandy, to meet with the Rider Oversight Committee to talk about some of the metrics. This is all very interesting. I know we have a long meeting, and there are some questions and some ideas that I'd like to discuss. And so you don't have to say yes now. I'll just extend an invitation. I'll follow up with you. But with respect to MWRTA, and this might be better addressed to the representative from the MWRTA, you mentioned that one of the reasons that you are increasing the target for the safety metrics is to encourage people to report incidents. I hope this isn't too sensitive, but I'm asking this just to get us insights for other organizations, whether transit or not. What are the inklings that you have that maybe it's being underreported?
Tyler or anyone at Metro West, I will defer to you on this one. But as I explained, while the slides were up, yes, there is, as I understand it, a policy of increased encouragement on transit worker employees to report incidents of all types.
Yes, this is Tyler from the MWRTA. Len, thank you for your question, and certainly happy to discuss that with our team. We have a team that addresses and implements policies related to safety, and I'll be happy to respond to you through the chair.
Oh yeah, that's why, like I said, I'm just interested. It's not a critique at all. More, it's like I think learning what you're seeing could be applicable to all of us in lots of different realms. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Are there other questions before I take a motion? Hannah, you have a question?
It's more of, I guess, a question / a comment, and then I'm happy to make the motion. So will this presentation essentially, I know it's on the MPO website already, but is it something that we can share in terms of even like MBTA advisory board sharing it with our members in terms of safety, or like even with like rapid transit committee, and just I feel like there's a lot of overlap, and if people see this type of information, it might be very helpful to the work that we all do in terms of our collaborations.
So I can answer that. You can share this with anybody you want. Jen, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I first a thank you to the T, CADA, MWRTA for the work to report on at past and project future performance, and to Sam for pulling it all together for review and endorsement. I did want to follow up on a request that I'd made last year for these targets to be presented in the context of sort of year-over-year trend lines of past performance, similar to what we saw for roadway safety performance targets. I found, seeing that visual really helpful in assessing whether these, projections, because again, we've had this conversation, these are really projections and not goals, and kind of being able to see whether those projections seem reasonable or not. I know that some of these targets are new ones, so you may not have prior years, but I did want to check back with the transit agencies and see if this is something they'd explored or would be willing to explore going forward.
Then you have your hand up anyway, so why don't you answer that question if you could? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, that was for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I actually think Mike Katzos from our safety team is here, and he can speak
good.
much more fluently to the MBTA questions than I can. So Mike, if you are here and you want to raise your hand so that the chair can call on you, would love to have you, respond to Len's offer and also to Jen's question.
Mike, whenever you're ready.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Katzos. I'm Director of Safety Management Systems and Safety Oversight with the MBTA. And my team is the team that helps to prepare and generate our performance targets. I want to make sure I'm answering everything, so please cut in if I'm not covering everything. But, Jen, to your question about putting these in context with some of the historic information, I would say that it's at least a possibility. We monitor our performance in relation to these targets continuously. So we're always generating, processing, cleaning up new data. And then, as we touched on a little bit earlier, we, to the extent of our ability, set them in relation to past performance so that we can make sure when we're targeting an improvement, it's something that's reasonable and supported by the best historic performance information that we have. So I do think we would be able to, in the future, present these types of values with a little bit of historic context.
Thank you. Sam, you have your hand up. Do you have something you need to say or want to say?
Yes, I just also wanted to add that I encourage, especially in response to Jen's comment, which I very much tend to agree with. What I can do is I can direct you to the MPO's performance dashboard, which is on the MPO's website, and I can leave the link for that in the chat. That will show more of a historical trend line type of display of transit safety metrics, as well as our other performance areas.
Thank you, Sam. Any other questions? Seeing none, can I get a motion and a second to adopt the targets as presented today? Please state your name for the record. Lynn Diggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was going to second Hannah's motion, but I'll go ahead and make the motion to adopt the standards, the targets.
Thank you. Is there a second? Jen Rowe.
I'll second that motion.
Thank you. Motion has been made and seconded. Please call the roll.
David Moeller,
Yes.
Tracy Lenhart,
Tracy Lenhart, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Sandy Johnston,
Sandy Johnston, yes.
Tyler Terasi,
Tyler Terasi, yes.
Sarah Lee,
Sarah Lee, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassi, yes.
Hannah Switlikowski,
Hannah Swilikowski, yes.
Len Diggins,
Diggins, yes.
Jen Rowe,
Jen Rowe, yes.
Nayeli Rodriguez,
Nayeli Rodriguez, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kosis,
David Kozis, yes.
John Alessi,
John Alessi, yes.
Aaron Shute,
Aaron Shute, yes.
Kayla Sauer,
Kayla Sauer, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
And that motion carries.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is the TIP amendment number 7 to the 2025 to 2029 TIP. Ethan LaPointe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everybody. My name is Ethan LaPointe. I'm the Transportation Improvement Program Manager with the Boston Region MPO. My first of 3 presentations here today is Amendment 7 for the federal fiscal year's 2025-29 TIP. This is going to culminate in a request for an endorsement of the amendment. If we can go on to the next slide. Just as a reminder here, if we can move on to the next slide, please. Amendment 7 was an amendment that is complementary to the next action item here, Amendment 8. In this case, it programmed 3 federal discretionary grant awards through the EPA's Federal Fiscal Year 2024 Clean Heavy Duty Vehicles, or CHDV, grant program for 3 different school districts within the Boston region. This was an award for Boston Public Schools, the joint Hamilton-Wenham School District, and also for Hingham Public Schools as well. This amendment was separate from other items in Amendment 8, originally as we were monitoring different timelines for potentially delivering these grant awards, though as we get to the next slide, Amendment 7 has an identical public comment period to Amendment 8, which began on January 17th and concluded February 7th. There were no public comments received during this period, and thus MPO staff on the next slide are requesting that this board votes to endorse Amendment 7.
Thank you, Ethan. Any questions for Ethan? Kim Miller, you have a question about why this has to go in the TIP?
Exactly, yes.
Yeah, me too. But go ahead and ask it, Quinn, since you have your hand raised.
Why is this have to be on the TIP? Are these Title 20, Title 23, or Title 49 funds?
Yes, I believe in consultation with some other folks at Federal Highway, they were identified for Title 23.
Can you?
I can forward you the email chain, Ken, if that helps. I need to track this down. I
That
believe
would be
they are
helpful.
Title 23.
Okay, if they are, that's fine. If not, so things that have to be on the TIP, either Title 23 or Title 49 funds, or Federal Highway or Federal Transit have to take it. They can be other. It doesn't have to be title. If we have to take an action, it can also be on the TIP. I'm not aware that we have to take an action, but yeah, if you can forward that to me, that would be great. But I would request that maybe just conditionally endorse this, and maybe you know, I don't want to hold things up, but if it doesn't have to be on the TIP, I would recommend that it not be.
I do have an update there. I believe this falls under classification for any non-zero emission class 6 or 7 heavy duty vehicle under Title 23. I'll forward the email chain over to you, Ken, but that is the language that I have that is requiring the amendment here.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. So can I get a motion and a second to approve this amendment with the understanding that if we ended up agreeing with Federal Highway that we don't need to do this amendment, I'll never submit it to them? Can I get a motion and a second to approve? Please state your name for the record.
Nayeli Rodriguez, I can motion to approve, and just want to express thank you to the board and MPO staff and MassDOT for putting this together.
Eric Barassa.
I'll second the motion. Eric Barassa.
Thank you. Motion has been made and seconded. Please call the roll.
David Moeller,
Yes.
Tracy Lenhard,
Tracy Lenhart, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Sandy Johnston,
Sandy Johnston, yes.
Tyler Terasi,
Tyler Terasi, yes.
Sarah Lee,
Sarah Lee, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Hannah Switkowski,
Hannah Switkowski, yes.
Leonard Dickens,
Dickens, yes.
Jen Rowe,
Jen Rowe, yes.
Nayeli Rodriguez,
Nayeli Rodriguez, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kosis,
David Kozis, yes.
John Alessi,
Yes.
Aaron Shute,
Aaron Chute, yes.
Kayla Sauer,
Kayla Sauer, yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Wynn, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
And that motion carries.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is amendment number 8, Ethan Lapointe.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Moving on to the next amendment, Amendment 8. This amendment largely addresses projects, on the next slide, please, that were covered under other categories of discretionary grant awards and also one change in the statewide highway program. These being federal Safe Streets and Roads for All grant awards and a prioritization process pilot program grant award for the Boston Region MPO. I would like to note as a correction here that for that project prioritization process pilot, or P4 for shorthand, grant for the MPO, the cost that was listed for the amendment was about $1.86 million. That was because of an assumption that there was a 20% match component for the project. The award amount is $1,488 million. Or I should say, sorry, $1,488,000. Long morning, and is not required to have a match there. So the line item should reflect the revised amount absent the 20% match. Otherwise, there are no other changes for any of the other awards included within this amendment. And as a reminder, these were Safe Streets and Roads for All grant awards for the City of Quincy, City of Watertown, and Town of Needham. With that, if we can go on the next slide, as I previously mentioned, Amendment 8 had the same public comment period as Amendment 7, going from January 17th to February 7th at 5 p.m. And as with Amendment 7, there were no public comments received during that public comment period. MPO staff on the next slide are requesting that the board votes to endorse Amendment 8, inclusive of that cost change I mentioned earlier, where there is no match required for that project prioritization improvement program grant.
Thank you, Ethan. Any questions for Ethan? Seeing none, can I get a motion and a second to adopt the amendment as presented today? And please state your name for the record when making a motion. Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa, I'll make a motion to adopt as presented today.
Thank you. Aaron Shute.
I second that motion. Aaron.
Thank you. Motion has been made and seconded. Please call the roll.
David Moeller,
Yes.
Tracy Lenhart,
Tracy Lenhart, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Sandy Johnston,
Sandy Johnston, yes.
Tyler Terasi,
Tyler Terasi, yes.
Sarah Lee,
Sarah Lee, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Hannah Switkowski,
Hannah Switkowski, yes.
Leonard Dickens,
Dickens, yes.
Jen Rowe,
Jen Rowe, yes.
Nayeli Rodriguez,
Nayeli Rodriguez, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kosis,
David Kozis, yes.
John Alessi,
Yes.
Aaron Shute,
Aaron Chute, yes.
Kayla Sauer,
Kayla Sauer, yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Wynn, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
And that motion carries.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is Amendment 2 to the UPWP. Olivia,
Hello,
whenever
good
you're ready.
morning. Thank you. My name is Olivia Sakosha, and I am the UPWP Program Manager. Today I'll be presenting Amendment 2 to the FFY 2025 UPWP, which would add 8 federal discretionary grants to the document's appendix. And at our last UPWP committee meeting, the committee voted to approve this amendment to bring to the board. And like Chris mentioned earlier, there is not a federal requirement to hold public comment periods for UPWP amendments, which is why we are presenting this today for the board to vote on. So if we could move to the next slide, please. Overall, of the 8 discretionary grants, it includes 1 prioritization process pilot program grant, 1 congestion relief grant, 3 Safe Streets and Roads for All grants, and 3 Reconnecting Communities pilot program grants. And I can briefly explain these grants, so we can move on to the next slide, please. So starting with the first one on this chart, the Boston Region MPO was awarded a $1,488,000 prioritization process pilot program grant. And this will enable the MPO to review and improve its process for assessing projects to include in the Transportation Improvement Program and the Long Range Transportation Plan. And next, MassDOT, MAPC, and the City of Boston were awarded a $21.6 million congestion relief grant to implement new shuttle networks in Boston and to improve the region's Blue Bike system. And we can go to the next slide, please. So now I can discuss the 3 Safe Streets for All grants. The first, for the City of Quincy, the city was awarded an SS4A grant of $126,400 to conduct demonstration activities through the city's Transportation Safety Action Plan. The City of Watertown was awarded a grant of $806,192 to develop an educational campaign, conduct a citywide speed limit study, and implement traffic calming demonstration activities within the city. And the town of Needham was also awarded an SS4A grant of $320,000 to conduct demonstration activities to temporarily redesign Great Plain Avenue. And as part of this project, the street will have improved pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure, and the number of car travel lanes will be reduced from 2 in each direction to 1. And if we move to the next slide, these last 3 grants are all Reconnecting Communities pilot program grants. So first, the City of Boston was awarded a $2 million RCP grant to redesign Mattapan Square, and this will reconnect the neighborhood and improve multimodal connectivity. The City of Revere was awarded a $400,000 RCP grant for their Walking to Wonderland project. And through this, the city will conduct a feasibility study to plan for several multi-use shared paths that will connect to Wonderland Station. And lastly, the MBTA was awarded a $2 million RCP grant to bring the JFK UMass station into a state of good repair and also improve its accessibility and environmental resiliency. So if we move on to the next slide. MPO staff today asked for the board's endorsement of this amendment as it was presented today to reflect these 8 discretionary grants into the FFY 2025 UPWP. And now I will turn it to the chair for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Olivia? I just have one. So many of these projects were also just amended into the tip. Is there a reason that we're being required to put them in both of our documents? I mean, I don't really mind. It's not a problem, but is there a reason?
It's my understanding that this is a new request that was asked of us from the FHWA this summer. I don't know if Ethan, you wanted to talk about it more.
Ethan?
Thank you. Was waiting to be called on. Yeah, what Olivia said is absolutely correct there. So thank you, Olivia. I will just clarify that some of these grants, like the Safe Streets and Roads for All demonstration grants, are a combination of capital construction grants and planning grants. And we were directed with some guidance from Federal Highway and also folks at MassDOT to include them in both documents to be safe. But yes, these have also been included in TIP amendments already, some of them in Amendment 8, which was just endorsed.
Okay, thanks. Can I get a motion and a second to approve this amendment as presented today? And please state your name for the record. Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa, MAPC. I'll make a motion to approve the UPWP amendment as presented today and hope that all these grants actually come through in the end.
Thank you, Eric. Jen Rowe.
I will second that motion.
Thank you. Motion having been made and seconded. Please call the roll.
David Moeller,
Yes.
Tracy Lenhart,
Yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Sandy Johnston,
Sandy Johnson, yes.
Tyler Terasi,
Tyler Terasi, yes.
Sarah Lee,
Sarah Lee, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Hannah Switlikowski,
Hannah Switlikowski, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Diggins, yes.
Jen Rowe,
Jen Rowe, yes.
Nayeli Rodriguez,
Natalie Rodriguez, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kosis,
David Kozis, yes.
John Alessi,
Let's see, yes.
Aaron Shute,
Aaron Shute, yes.
Kayla Sauer,
Kayla Sauer, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Okay, that motion carries.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda, I believe is, yes, TIP project readiness update for FY 2026 is 30. Ethan LaPointe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, so for
No,
my
thank
third,
you, Ethan.
I still have to present the rest of this amendment here, or presentation here, but this is my third presentation today for the TIP readiness status and scenario for the next federal fiscal years 2026 and 30 TIP. So if we can go on to the next slide, just for an overview of this presentation, we'll start off by discussing some of the materials that are available on the MPO meeting calendar for reference throughout. I'll also go into just an update on public comments that MPO staff have received since some prior MPO meetings and how they relate to some of the projects that may come up in today's presentation. I'll give some background on what MassDOT's TIP Readiness Days exercise is and how historically the MPO has incorporated the recommendations that MassDOT delivers into programming for new TIP development cycles, and then go into the real meat and potatoes of the presentation, which is the specific readiness changes for projects by year, then culminating in a review of a subsection of those projects that are of fairly substantial funding size and are therefore funded with what we call advanced construction dollars, meaning that they're funded across multiple years of the TIP due to their budget or their construction schedule, as well as is the case for most major capital projects. I'll then mostly discuss some TIP Cost Change Committee policies and the applicability, referring to the Cost Change Committee from 2021 that had looked at the deployment of potential policies as countermeasures to a consistent trend of increasing costs on TIP projects, and then, of course, fielding any questions and discussion. If we can go to the next slide, just to kind of get into the meeting materials for this and the one after that, the readiness scenario for the federal fiscal years 2026 to 30 TIP is available on the meeting calendar for reference throughout this presentation. For those who attended last week's meeting of the TIP Process Engagement Readiness Committee, this scenario is identical to the one that was presented there as well. And again, I will be moving in order down this spreadsheet later in this presentation to discuss each of the projects that are listed here. As a readiness scenario, this is going to set the baseline upon which future decisions for projects, which will be made in future MPO meetings, will take place. Now, If we go on to the next slide, just to kind of describe the layout of this scenario, there have been some changes versus what you may be familiar with if you joined us during last year's TIP development or prior ones. Projects are now sorted in order of their current programmed year, starting with projects that are programmed currently in federal fiscal year 2025. Any projects that are delayed out of that year exist at the bottom portion of their year tranche. We've also added some new columns to this table versus what previous scenarios indicated, including an initial TIP year and TIP. What this is referring to is a new column that would show when a project was initially programmed, including the TIP that it first appeared in, and what year it was programmed in for that TIP. So you may see a project, for example, that says 2024, federal fiscal years 2022-2024, which means that the project was first programmed in fiscal 24 back in the 2020 to 24 TIP. There's also an additional column that shows the years since the last project info milestone for a project. This is a column that calculates based on the number of the date that is included in MassDOT's project info system, the number of years since a specific design milestone update in MassDOT's public-facing project info system. This does not mean if you see a project with, for example, 4 on there, which would imply 4 years since last update, that the project has not made progress in 4 years. It just means that it has not achieved a new design threshold in 4 years. So permits may have been attained in the interim, for example. What this column is meant to contribute to the discussion today is that it may be a useful proxy for assessing the risk of a cost increase on a project if there has not been a design milestone update across a certain number of years. Generally speaking, the greater the number of years since a design milestone update, the higher the risk on many of the projects that may be indicated here today. And I'll discuss that risk more later in this presentation. As far as color coding on this scenario spreadsheet, if we go on the next slide, I'll start off by talking about text colors here. If there is a cell text color of orange, that is a moderate risk flag on a project. If there's a cell text color of red on a project, that is a high risk flag. A cell text color that is in a cost field may indicate a delay or a cost increase beyond either 25 or $2.5 million or 10% on a project. Now, we're not going to talk too much about specific project scopes in this presentation today. We went into more detail on that during last week's TIP committee meeting, and I'll discuss that in a little bit more later. But in that meeting, we discussed these risk types in more detail. Generally, MPO staff are using 3 different definitions of risk to categorize projects: either readiness risk, projects that may be at risk to not meet their advertising date; cost risk, projects that may be on track, but if they do slip, may see a cost increase; or projects that have not had a cost estimate in some years; and program risk. Program risk refers to projects that either due to the size of their budget, where if they even have a moderate risk of, say, a readiness issue, that they may create spillover effects to other years of the TIP. You can think of program risk as a combination of readiness and cost risk. Large-scale projects where if they slide, they may cause impacts to projects in multiple years of the TIP. Generally speaking, program risk is something pervasive across any large-scale project the MPO could or would fund, namely the projects that are programmed in the MPO's long-range plan. And lastly, for the color scheme on the next slide, this then moves into cell shade colors. Any projects that are in a white cell do not have any schedule change. Any projects in a red cell are recommended to be delayed 1 or more years. There are no projects for acceleration, which would be normally classified as green, and there is only one new line item listed in this scenario, which is a tentative line item pending further discussion from the board, creating a set-aside fund for project design in later years of the TIP, as was requested as part of previous TIP development cycles. This is in blue. With that, we have one other material item on the next slide to discuss: the TIP cost change policy memo, which was presented to the MPO board back in September of 2021, is also reposted here on the MPO calendar. I'll be referring in more detail to this project cost policy memo at the tail end of this presentation. And before we move on, like I said earlier, there are some differences while the materials are the same between the presentation I'm giving here today and the more in-depth discussion that we had at the TIP committee last week. This presentation is going to focus more on policy. The recording of last week's TIP committee meeting is currently available on the MPO's YouTube page, and MPO staff are also available as part of either the discussion period of this presentation or after this meeting in one-on-ones to discuss project details a little bit more specifically than I will do so in my presentation. Excuse me. Moving into, on the next slide, the public comment update, which will preface some of the cost changes that we'll be discussing later here. On the next slide, please. MPO staff have received a series of comment letters related to 3 projects, mostly expressing support in all 3 cases to continue advancing them or keeping them in their currently programmed year. The Belmont Community Path Project, which is their extension of the Massachusetts Central Rail Trail, has received multiple letters of support. The project is not proposed for any change in schedule or cost as part of this scenario. The next project in Hingham for the improvements to Route 3A is currently in fiscal 2026 and is potentially going to be delayed to federal fiscal year 2027 under this scenario, and also includes a cost increase. MPO staff have received letters from residents to keep the project in its current position, and MPO staff will also be meeting with both the state representative for the town of Hingham and also, the district within which Hingham is situated in, and also town staff from Hingham right after this MPO meeting. We've also received letters of support for Swampscott's rail trail construction project, which may be proposed for a delay out of federal fiscal year 2028, as the project is not currently yet at 25% design. I'll note as well, just for reference, the letter that the MPO staff received from the town of Hingham to support this project is also attached to the MPO calendar and goes into much more detail about the nature of the utility needs for the project than was discussed at last week's TIP committee meeting as well. So it is also a helpful reference point there. On the subject of reference points and background, if we go on the next slide, I'll just describe what TIP Readiness Days is in a little bit more detail for those who may be newly joining us in the TIP development process. And on the next slide, please. So TIP Readiness Days is an annual multi-day meeting of MassDOT staff internally, but they also meet with each of the MPOs across the Commonwealth. The team that MassDOT sets up for Readiness Days each year solicits the perspectives from each MPO among their staff, the program management unit for the respective project within MassDOT, the MassDOT Highway District for that project, the right-of-way section, environmental section, and also the final director's office recommendation for that meeting. Between each of these 6 parties that provides feedback on a project, MassDOT then delivers a recommended readiness year to be considered for the development of the next TIP or STIP. It's worth noting that as part of Readiness Days, the project cost or cost increase and therefore fiscal constraint may not necessarily be taken into account at that stage for the recommended readiness year. This is something that's a little bit more relevant to later discussions of scenarios that we will have, as I will get into shortly. Now, historically, on the next slide, Readiness Days has been a little bit more reactive, but due to some decisions that this MPO has made, there have been some process improvements that have allowed MPO staff and the TIP committee and also MassDOT to all work together to deliver some countermeasures and some mitigations and also deliver information at an earlier state. The first has been the quarterly readiness updates. Technically, this is today a quarterly readiness update for February, but we also had one back in December where some of these projects I'll be noting here today were initially flagged. We have also had the sub-regional readiness days. This was a new measure incorporated this year, which utilized that existing perspective that MPO staff were encouraged to provide to MassDOT to act as a vessel for the municipal perspective to be further considered in the TIP development process. It's also worth noting that in addition to last week's meeting to discuss these TIP changes in more detail with the TIP committee has met for over the past few months to discuss and forecast both project readiness and also anticipated issues with regard to fiscal constraint and new application volumes around this TIP. So with that, on the next slide, we'll get into readiness recommendations by year. I'll summarize them first. The majority of projects that are currently programmed in federal fiscal year 2026 are being recommended for a delay into federal fiscal year 2027, and that's going to lead to a substantial funding deficit in 27. One new thing that is happening with this tip cycle versus the past few years is that this is being compounded by projects that are currently in federal fiscal year 2025 being delayed into 2026. For example, if you had joined us for the federal fiscal year 25 to 29 development last year, this would be like if projects were delayed out of 24 into 25. This is not something that has happened in recent years. Functionally, these projects were not anticipated to be within this next upcoming tip cycle, had they not been delayed. It's also worth noting that MPO staff are continuing to learn new information on cost increases, including some cases where new cost estimates have emerged, either upward or downward, on projects even since last week's meeting and presentation to the TIP committee. It's worth noting that a sizable cross-section of projects currently on the TIP have not had new design thresholds attained and therefore new cost increases in 3 years. And this also includes a large number of projects that are already at 25% design and are either advancing towards a revised 25% or 75% submission. Also, just comparing this year's TIP changes versus other TIP readiness days, the delays in the middle years of the TIP appear to be less frequent than the trends that we saw for federal fiscal years 25-29 development and 24-28 development. It's worth noting that while this may initially indicate a positive trend, in order to make an informed readiness recommendation, MassDOT staff need updated schedules from project proponents. Something that I said at the TIP committee meeting last week is that no news is not necessarily good news for many of these projects. On the next slide, I'll show more the bottom line fiscal constraint numbers for each of the 5 years of this next TIP and also federal fiscal year 2025. The bottom line here again is that there are surpluses in 2026, which is subject to programming as part of our programming scenarios over the next few weeks, and also in 2025, which may need to be addressed by a TIP amendment to the current 25-29 TIP. There's also deficits in 2027 and 28, and additional funding in 29 and 30. If we go on the next slide, just to go into this in a little bit more detail, the project delays that are out of federal fiscal year 2025, which we'll get into more detail on later, are leading to a fairly sizable unprogrammed balance there. And as I mentioned, in tandem with scenario development, it will require a TIP amendment to utilize the anticipated $24.6 million of unprogrammed balance. It's worth noting, of course, that not all $24.6 million of that needs to be programmed. Some of it can be kept in reserve for cost increases, though there are not too many projects remaining in federal fiscal year 25 in the regional target program that have yet to advertise, though there are, I believe, 2 after these delays. And again, this will require a TIP amendment, which MPO staff are currently coordinating with MassDOT staff with to try and orchestrate that. It would likely emerge in early March, and more information will be provided when it is available there. On the next slide, we also then see a widespread array of delays out of federal fiscal year 2026, which is driving a fairly large unprogrammed balance. However, those projects that were pushed out of 25 into 26 are tempering the overall surplus. So if we go on the next slide, what you would then see is that while there's $65.3 million available in 2026, there is a deficit of about $84.7 million in 2027. Functionally, this is leading to a logjam. And even though there was only one project proposed for delay out of fiscal year 2027 into 2028 due to low funding reserves in 28 and also some cost increases on projects in that year, there is a deficit, though it is much smaller than the one currently forecasted for 2027. Worth noting on the next slide as well, as we look at the funding that is available in fiscal 2030, that the ongoing funding commitments to projects that were utilizing advanced construction, including both not only long-range transportation plan projects, but also projects that were newly funded in the TIP last year for fiscal 29, have limited funding availability in federal fiscal year 2030 to about 31% of the overall $160 million that was initially forecasted to be available for programming. This is to say that the commitments that the MPO had already made have accounted for about 69% of all the funding that we received this year. Also worth noting when comparing this this readiness situation to last year's readiness situation on the next slide, there is a $96 million deficit between federal fiscal years 2027 and 28 in this scenario, and there's a $54 million funding surplus between federal fiscal years 29 and 2030. Last year, the MPO board had opted to shift some of the funding burden in the deficit years of the 25-29 tip to the outer years to alleviate that deficit instead of removing projects and rather just delaying projects. There is insufficient funding available in the later years of the tip to employ that strategy this year. So again, on the next slide, I'm going to start talking very briefly about each of the projects listed here. I won't be going into any major detail on why these projects are moving. Instead, I would recommend that members refer to the TIP committee presentation from last week, and also welcome any comments during the discussion phase or after this meeting in a one-on-one to go into that further detail. So on the next slide, something I mentioned earlier is that when we were developing the federal fiscal years 25-29 tip, there were no projects that were flagged to fall out of federal fiscal year 2024 into that new tip window. In developing this new tip, there's 3 projects in fiscal 25 that are projected to be delayed into the federal fiscal year 26 tip, and some of these have also seen cost increases. On net, these 3 projects amount to about $31 million of total volume. These projects are, on the next slide, the multi-use path construction of the Independence Greenway in Peabody at Interstate 95 and Route 1. It's worth noting this is a different project from the other Independence Greenway section, which was delayed from fiscal 24 to 25 this past summer via TIP amendment. This project recently hit 100% design and also has a 58% cost increase due to the bridges there, although staff do have a revised cost estimate that's about $3 million lower that we're currently tracking on this project. So the cost increase is not as great, though it is still substantial. The next project is Medford's shared use path connection at the Route 28 Wellington underpass. This project is also at 100%. Something I want to mention for this project, as well as the prior Peabody project, is that they were recommended to be potentially capable of making an aggressive federal fiscal year 2025 quarter 4 add date if certain permitting actions went well. In order to preserve funding for these projects rather than wait, MPO staff have coordinated with the project proponents in the municipalities, and both the City of Medford and City of Peabody have accepted, or rather requested, that their projects be programmed in fiscal 26 for a quarter 1 advertisement date in order to ensure that funding persists for these projects. The third project within the City of Woburn, which is the intersection construction at Route 3, Cambridge Road, and Bedford Road, has actually already been addressed by a TIP amendment that was recently made to the federal fiscal year 2025 to 26 tip and is being delayed into 26 and reflected as part of 2630 tip development. If we go on the next slide, that then takes us into our 26 projects. Something that I'll mention here on the next slide, just to kind of talk about trends here. When we were developing the 24-28 tip, 4 out of 10 of the projects in year 1, 2024, were proposed for delay. In developing the 25-29 tip, 6 out of 9 of the projects in 25 were proposed for delay. And 3 of those 6 projects had been delayed back in the 24-28 tip in year 1. So, which is to say, they had been delayed already. In the 26-30 tip development, we're looking at 7 out of 9 projects in fiscal year 26 that are being proposed for delay. 4 of those were delayed during the 25-29 tip development process, and 2 of those 4 were also delayed in the federal fiscal years 24 to 28 tip development process. Now, these projects, if we go on the next slide, start off with 4 projects that were already indicated to the TIP committee at the quarterly readiness update back in December on the 19th. These being the intersection improvements at Route 1 and University Avenue in Norwood. It's worth noting that this project is a few years overdue for a revised submission for a 25% design or 75% design, and is also seeing a scope change due to the inclusion of a new culvert being incorporated in the project. It's also a project listed on the MPO's long-range plan. The next project is also seeing a scope change. This is within the City of Boston for improvements on Boylston Street. The project currently as scoped, includes an intersection that is proposed to no longer be included in the project, as that intersection is a DCR, Department of Conservation and Recreation asset. The cost estimate that is also listed here of $15 million was an approximate estimate generated by the consultant for the city of Boston on the higher end of the project that still included that intersection within the project scope. A revised estimate for the project is being calculated that includes the omission, or rather reflects the new scope of work for the Boylston Street project for the city. The next project is for the town of Milford for the rehabilitation of Route 16. Worth noting that this project is a MassDOT proponent project for the town, and it does require a third resubmission of its 25% design. And the next project is the rehabilitation of Essex Street in the city of Lynn, which is still pending a submission for 25% design. These projects, again, are all proposed for delay out of federal fiscal year 26 into 27. And these projects were also all flagged back in December. There were 3 additional projects on the next slide also proposed for delay to fiscal 27. This first project with the City of Chelsea is a MassDOT proponent project, and it's for targeted safety improvements and related work on Broadway. Something I will mention here is that this was a fill-in project from MassDOT due to a funding surplus in fiscal 26, back when we were developing the federal fiscal years 24-28 TIP. Due to the anticipated deficit in federal fiscal year 2027, this project may be shifted, pending MassDOT funding availability, from MPO target funding back to statewide highway funding where it originally began prior to the 24-28 TIP. It's also worth noting, this is an update from last week's meeting, that this was one of several projects that were delayed to fiscal 27 that are within the city of Chelsea. The MPO is currently funding a project that was not delayed on Park and Pearl Street in the city of Chelsea, and due to traffic coordination issues, given Chelsea is a fairly small city, the emergence of other projects both within city limits and also close to city limits right on the border, the city is requesting that the MPO also consider removal of the Park and Pearl Street project as well to be included in federal fiscal year 2031 of the next TIP development cycle. I'll have more information on that in a later presentation. This is just an emerging topic that MPO staff are continuing to work with MassDOT and the city on with regard to traffic coordination and how each of the different projects in the area coordinate with each other. The next project is the improvements on Route 3A for the town of Hingham. This project has seen a cost increase of about 15.6%, or $4.5 million. It is worth noting that this is beyond a cost increase of about 91% that was witnessed during last year's TIP on this project. And as mentioned previously, MPO staff will be meeting with personnel from the town and also some of their elected officials to discuss this project in further detail this afternoon. One project that was newly added to the TIP last year, which was Quincy's intersection improvement at Willard Street and Ricciuti Drive project, has increased in cost by about 96.3% after a 75% design resubmission. And the project cost is now at about increased from about $1.9 million to $3.7 million. So the actual cost increase is $1.8 million, despite the fairly substantial 96% that I mentioned earlier. Moving into 27, this is again, as I mentioned earlier, where the rate of delays begins to taper off. There's only one project recommended for delay in fiscal 27, this one due to wetlands considerations, and this is the reconstruction of Route 30 in the town of Weston. This project was also flagged last year for delay, as some members may recall, and is proposed again due to those emerging wetlands concerns. The project has not had any changes in its cost estimate, though it is worth noting there's been some progress made on a fairly substantial housing development that is abutting this project area, and staff have been in contact with the town just to ensure that we can continue to coordinate on this project with regard to changing housing development and other needs in that neighborhood. Moving on to federal fiscal year 2028, I will note that with these next two projects, these projects were not recommended for delay by MassDOT staff. Rather, these were recommended for delay either by the project proponent or MPO staff in consultation with the project proponent, or just considering progress made over the past year. The next, on the next slide, the first of these is the reconstruction of Rutherford Ave for the city of Boston. I'll get into that later in this presentation when we talk about the advanced construction projects. There is a new schedule for this project, as was presented back on the December 19th MPO meeting, targeting a 25% design submission for December. but the new project schedule does indicate that it would warrant a fiscal 29 delay. Excuse me. The next project is the Spot Pond Brook Greenway project in the city of Malden. This project is still awaiting a 25% design submission and has been pending additional progress towards that 25% design submission due to some repeated issues with staff turnover over at the city. MPO staff are in touch with the city of Malden. We're discussing this further. It's worth noting that in addition to some emerging interests for the Route 60 corridor in the city of Malden that city is pursuing, I believe there's also an ongoing scoping meeting as I speak about the Broadway corridor in the city of Malden, which is another project that the city is looking to advance. As I mentioned earlier in this presentation, coordinating and prioritizing projects is something that MPO staff are also looking to consider when these recommendations are being made. With that, on the next slide, that takes us to our major capital projects update, as there are no projects in fiscal 29 that are being looked at for delay this year. So there are 3 projects that I'll be covering here in some detail. Again, we went into a little bit more detail during last week's TIP committee meeting. As was previously presented back in the fall, the McGrath Boulevard project, which is a MassDOT project that the city of Somerville is working very closely with MassDOT on, has recently had a 25% design submission back in October, which has triggered a cost increase for the project from an initial anticipated funding amount or cost of $95.3 million to $128.4-ish million as a result of that 25%. Now, the project is also tagged as a high-risk project because of that cost, and MassDOT is also weighing potential phasing of the project, given how a certain component of the project, which is being weighed by certain parties within the city of Somerville, may trigger additional permitting needs for the project if it is included in the project scope. It's worth noting that those discussions are still underway, and there have not been any changes to project scope resulting from this. Though another primary consideration for this project is that it was awarded a Reconnected Communities grant from the United States Department of Transportation. With the match included in that grant, the total grant burdened is about $53.75 million. It is worth noting what this programming scenario reflects does not include this grant award due to various risks with regard to how disruptive that grant could be if it is included in. Rather, MPO staff with this readiness recommendation are reflecting a programming scenario where the project is fully funded with regional target dollars between federal fiscal years 27 and 2030. When we had the 25-29 TIP, based on the old cost estimate, the 2030 contribution was expected to be about $5 million to the project. This year, due to the cost increase, it's projected to be about $35 million to the project. This is a net increase in the funding commitment by the MPO for this TIP of about $33.07 million, or about $28 million more than MPO staff had projected last year, again resulting from this 25% design submission. If we go on to the next slide, there is one project that is not listed in the MPO's long-range plan, though its cost estimate is approaching that figure. This is the rehabilitation of Western Avenue in the city of Lynn. This project has a 6-year-old cost estimate and is being tagged for high risk as a result. The cost estimate is at about $45.9 million. That is inflation adjusted at about 4% a year. And again, as I mentioned, it is not listed in the long-range plan, but is approaching similar cost scale. The contribution for fiscal 2030 and programming amount there is targeted about $10.9 million. This is also a fairly substantial and complex project with regard to intersection control evaluation. So MPO staff are working and have been talking with the city fairly closely to determine what any revised cost estimates or timelines and schedules may look like for this project. And as mentioned earlier on the next slide, this is the reconstruction of Rutherford Avenue. The city of Boston has recommended, based on their latest schedule, a delay to fiscal 29 with a 25% design expected next winter. It is about 4.4 years since the latest cost estimate was obtained for this project within Project Info, and this programming scenario that is reflected here illustrates and assumes that that cost estimate holds at around $200 million. Due to the delay of this project, and also its fairly protracted advanced construction schedule, which I'll get to on the next slide, the new programming scenario reflects a $33.5 million commitment each year from 2029 and 2030, versus what was anticipated last year with a $33.5 million figure in 28, a $45 million figure in 29, an expected contribution of $35.5 million in 2030. Again, this is mostly related to overall fiscal constraint for the TIP program. And on the next slide, this shows the full funding spread that is projected for Rutherford Avenue, assuming that the current cost increase of about $200 million and an advertising date within federal fiscal year 2029 hold, with $33.5 million in 29 and 30, as reflected in this scenario, and about $130.8 million remaining to be programmed to this project, assuming that the MPO funds the remainder of the project between federal fiscal years 2031 and 2033. That requires a contribution of about $44 to $42 million a year, which is a fairly substantial escalation above commitments being proposed for this TIP scenario. Again, just to reiterate on the next slide, all of these changes, including these advanced construction considerations I just mentioned, are leading to a substantial surplus of funds in 25 and 26, deficits in 7 and 8, and then modest funding in 29 and 30. Excuse me. So, on the next slide, moving away from a project and readiness discussion more towards a policy discussion, I wanted to take some time to revisit some of the considerations and recommendations that were made by the TIP Cost Change Committee back in 2021. On the next slide, please. Back in spring of 21, this MPO board voted to establish an ad hoc committee to evaluate causes and consequences of cost increases on projects, and the committee delivered recommendations to the MPO board in September of that year. These recommendations include 3 interventions, the third of them with stages to the intervention, to be deployed as early as the federal fiscal years 23 to 27 TIP. Over these next few slides, I'm going to go into detail on what each of these interventions are, starting on the next slide with the project design status. This is likely the intervention that most members may be most familiar with, as is the one that is discussed and brought up most frequently. The project design status intervention proposed that projects that are trying to get on the TIP submit a 25% design plan and obtain updated cost estimates from MassDOT prior to their selection for the TIP, and also prior to inclusion in the long-range transportation plan as well. This intervention also included 3 secondary recommendations and considerations to be made. One around preliminary project evaluations, or allowing project proponents to have the opportunity to ask MPO staff to score their projects before 25% design to get an idea of where they may perform before a new application is made. Year-over-year design milestone benchmarking, referring to having project proponents report on their project status each year to MPO staff, and also developing new instructional materials for project proponents to refer to, like a TIP how-to guide or holding TIP how-to meetings. This third item was accomplished fairly swiftly by MPO staff, though there's opportunity for further work there. I want to discuss in a little bit more detail how these interventions have panned out over the past few years. So on the next slide, traditionally the 25% design rule leaned towards a matter of prioritization rather than being a strict requirement, and this was the result of slackened application volumes over the past few TIP cycles. It's also worth noting that these recommendations were made in 2021, and getting a 25% design on a TIP project today is a different process and also especially level of rigor for project proponents than it was when these recommendations were made. Moreover, a fairly rigorous process was established or conducted by MPO staff back in 2021 to determine why 25% design was a good threshold. This process used a 50 project sample looking at projects that had design milestone changes between federal fiscal year 2016 and 2021. While the methodology is sound, it's also worth noting that this methodology relied on projects that had 25% designs that could have been as early as 2016. My point of mentioning this is that there's been about 10 years in some of these cases since the 25% design policies and requirements have evolved over, which is to say, standards, changes, and requirements have changed, even if the term 25% design has not. Critically, as I'll get to on the next few slides, this intervention only applied to new project applications. On the next slide, About 35 projects are on the tip right now that MPO staff classify as core investment projects. Now, core projects refer to projects that are not community connections projects and are not in the transit transformation program. Transit transformation projects do not usually follow MassDOT design schedules. Moreover, these projects do not include any design line items either. Of these 35 projects, 14 of them were programmed onto the tip prior to the cost policy recommendations allegedly taking effect for the federal fiscal years 23 to 27 tip. So these 14 projects were programmed in the federal fiscal years 22 to 26 tip or earlier. I'll refer to these as legacy projects later in this presentation. The graph that's shown here on the right in gray shows the 21 projects that are not covered, or I should say, are technically covered by the policy recommendations, but they're in gray because I'm not going to go into much detail about their performance here until next slide. The other brackets show projects that are at other stages of design but are legacy projects. There are 7 projects in this legacy, or can we go back a slide, please? Sorry, I said next slide in that comment, and I think I may have led to some confusion. So of these 14 projects, there are 7 of them that are at 25% design. Of these 7 projects that are at 25, 3 of those have not progressed past their 25% submission or even resubmission since 2021, when these policies took effect. It's also worth noting, of these 14 projects, 2 of them are not at 25% design. So there are 2 projects not at 25% design. There are 3 projects that are at 25% design but have not moved since these policy cost recommendations took effect. There's 4 projects that have fairly recent 25% design submissions, and there are 5 projects that have made it past 25% design of this 14. What I'm trying to say here is that there's a sizable cross-section of projects that are currently not meeting the standards of the policy that superseded them and that they have been sort of made legacy projects under. This is relevant because on the next slide, if we actually look at what projects are being delayed this year, these legacy projects account for 8 of the 13 projects that are recommended for delayed. And of the remaining 5 projects, these 5 projects that were covered under the policy cost recommendations, only one of those 5 projects is not at 25% design. Specifically with the pre-2021 projects and those 8 that I mentioned, there are 2 at 75%, there are 5 at 25%, and there is 1 that is still not at 25%, despite being a legacy project that was covered under this threshold. For the new projects that followed it, only 1 of those projects is not yet applicable or was given flexibility with regard to the 25% design submission. The rest, interestingly, include 1 at 100% design and 2 at 75% design, which are more mature than that policy would normally require. So I do want to mention on the next slide that this is an effective intervention for limiting risk for projects. But as I mentioned earlier, the definition of 25% design has changed, and the policy and intervention should be adaptable to meet changing design standards and also the needs of project proponents as they've evolved. And these legacy projects are clearly a blind spot that are not covered by this policy. Now, with regard to secondary recommendations that I mentioned earlier, preliminary project evaluations have been invited of project proponents, but project proponents have not utilized them as the level of effort required to submit a project for preliminary evaluation is very similar to requiring the project to be submitted for formal evaluation. Annual benchmarking is something that MPO staff are going to work with the TIP committee to explore a little bit further as part of process improvements. As I mentioned earlier, the instructional materials are in place. As part of discussion here today, I'm not asking for any recommendations or changes to be made to these policies at this time, but I just want to highlight them to sort of start the discussion about what changes should be considered or factors should be considered for all projects in the TIP, and just sort of taking the dust off these policies that were presented about 3.5 years ago. So moving on to the second intervention, this is one that's been covered fairly thoroughly, so I won't go into too much detail here. The second intervention that's proposed was creating additional check-in points between MPO staff, the MPO board, project proponents, and MassDOT. quarterly readiness updates, sub-regional readiness days, the TIP committee, TIP office hours. These are all interventions that have been deployed in recent years that have allowed for better connections and discussions between staff and project proponents, and also delivering more information to MPO members to make these decisions at an earlier time. It is worth noting there are still some kinks to be worked out within this intervention, namely with regard to how this intervention as written would encourage project proponents to provide information, which means it's more of an opt-in rather than a requirement. Not all project proponents submit information or recommendations or perspective for TIP readiness days, nor do they attend quarterly readiness updates to report on changes, or sub-regional readiness days, or TIP office hours. Basically, the opt-in nature of this recommendation may warrant some revision towards more of a requirement for reporting. And for the third and final recommendation, this one is particularly relevant to the scenario discussion with regard to deficits. I am going to verbatim use some language that appears in the memo for the TIP project cost policy, which again is from September of 2021. Many of the changes or challenges that we've been witnessing over the past few TIP development cycles have persisted for some time. Just to read it verbatim here. For 3.2 under intervention 3, the resulting issues of project cost increases have meant that without a formal mechanism to reconsider projects that have significant cost changes, the MPO has historically maintained its funding commitments to all programmed projects. This includes covering any cost increases and accommodating scope or schedule changes without a great degree of scrutiny. Funding cost increases across the board limits the MPO's financial capacity to program new projects. In the absence of a formal, clear, and transparent policy, any enforcement action taken on a project for a cost increase could be considered arbitrary or unfair. This recommendation and intervention proposed a multi-step process at the MPO board's discretion to identify and select projects to be reconsidered under that formal mechanism. On the next slide, I'll go through each of the steps in detail. So the first step was one that we've actually partially incorporated into these readiness updates, setting a cost threshold where a project may either see a $2.5 million cost increase or 25% cost increase, whichever gets triggered first, and is flagged as a result for cost review during readiness days. Now, at MPO members' discretion, project proponents that trigger these thresholds would attend an MPO board meeting to explain the cause of the increase. As written, the intervention would also require that MPO staff plot all projects that are currently programmed on the TIP for a cost effectiveness matrix to allow MPO members to consider where each project falls in this cost effectiveness matrix that is shown on the screen on right and is lifted entirely from the project cost memo using that 50 project sample I mentioned earlier of projects funded between 2016 and 2026 back in 2021. Further steps on the next slide is that after consideration of the cost effectiveness, after flagging and reports from project proponents to the board, based on presentations from project proponents and any other relevant factors, including fiscal constraint, would choose to alter a project's status. And following that, the MPO board under step 4 would reconsider project status along 4 different lines. The first being that the MPO would fund the cost increase in the current federal fiscal year of the project. The second, which was actually employed last year, though this wasn't triggered by a formal process per se, using this specific intervention, was that the MPO would fund a cost increase in another federal fiscal year, including a delay, and that would be denial of MPO funding at the the third would be the denial of MPO funding at an increased cost, basically saying that the MPO would retain its existing funding level for the project, but the proponent would have to identify funding from a different source to cover the cost gap. Or the fourth case being total removal of the project from the TIP, with the return of the project to the TIP universe, allowing it to reapply in a future TIP year should funding become available in any of the years that it might be ready for. If we go on to the next slide, as I mentioned earlier, this policy is likely to be the one that is most relevant for this TIP cycle, though there are some major considerations here. For one, Because TIP project scoring is currently in the feedback phase where draft scores are largely in development, there's fairly limited time to conduct full plotting and rescoring processes for all of the projects on the TIP, these 13 projects that are all delayed. Though it is worth noting that back in September, MPO staff had, using the projects that were delayed from the 25-29 TIP, identified about 6 projects that MPO staff are already rescoring even before we're having this discussion with the MPO board, in anticipation of this issue potentially arising. Though it is worth noting that some of these projects MPO staff are rescoring are not being proposed for delay this year. It's also worth noting here that elevated application volumes, something we'll talk about more at the March 6th meeting, are going to introduce further constraint. Application volumes are up substantially with this TIP cycle, with about 11 transit transformation projects, 7 community connections projects, and 10 core investment program projects, along with a rescoring of about a dozen projects total when we include some of the design pilot projects from last year that are being reevaluated with this cycle. This policy is most valuable, this is kind of the conundrum here, in periods and times where scenarios are difficult to develop and therefore time is more constrained. When it is difficult to make a programming scenario, when there are a lot of different readiness issues, this is where this intervention is most effective. It's also the time when MPO staff don't have much time to actually deploy it. Also worth noting, this process has not been formally triggered before by the MPO board. It is something that MPO staff have tried to hedge bets on and establish contingencies for, doing some work in advance, but these projects are selected at the discretion of this board. So with that, I'll then move into key takeaways. On the next slide and the one after that, please, just some major considerations here. This is the first of multiple presentations and discussions about project programming. MPO staff are going to continue to work with MassDOT and project proponents to identify revised cost estimates for all of these projects that have not had them recently. And updated information about project costs will be provided to MPO members when available. It is worth noting the persistence of readiness issues in the near years of the TIP across multiple TIP years, particularly those deficits, is becoming more severe. The deficit that is in federal fiscal year 2027 this year is greater than the deficits that we witnessed in developing the TIP last year. And the TIP Cost Change Committee recommendations are even more relevant now than they were in 2021. With regard to upcoming meetings, as I mentioned before, there's plenty of more opportunities to discuss these issues further at the MPO board and also at TIP committee meetings. On the next slide, we have March 6th, which is a TIP scoring update for those new project applications I mentioned, and the possibility of introducing a new TIP amendment for consideration to address the unprogrammed funding balance that is now in federal fiscal year 2025. And on March 13th will be a TIP process engagement and readiness committee meeting to begin discussing initial programming scenarios. To support this discussion, MPO members are encouraged to request that project proponents here that are either proposed for delay or at risk, or even all projects at your discretion, could attend this committee meeting to provide further explanation. And it's also worth noting that MPO staff have recommended that proponents for new projects also be in attendance at that meeting should MPO members have any questions about their own progress or attainment of 25% designs. So with all of that in mind, if we can move on to the next slide, I'm happy to field any questions or discussion.
Thanks, Ethan. Questions for Ethan? Len?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to thank Ethan for the meeting that we had. Answered a lot of my questions, and I very much learned a lot. And so these are actually a couple of new things. Ethan, first, when it comes to the scoring, you explained to me a long time ago about the labor-intensive nature of the process. But are there any considerations for the next cycle? To figure out some ways to maybe automate this process. To make it faster, and at least give us a decent ballpark indication of how these projects were scored, so that we can use it in these cases where you say there's this tension, like we need to get the information fast, but we don't have the staff resources to do it.
Yes, that's a great question. That was actually the crux of the process prioritization pilot program grant that I mentioned in the TIP amendment presentation that I gave earlier in this meeting. Part of the objective of using that grant funding, if obtained, would be to develop a TIP scoring process that is more quantitative to complement the qualitative metrics. And by virtue of how that quantitative analysis is conducted, it could allow for greater automation of certain processes of TIP scoring. Now, thanks to a lot of the hard work that my colleague Adriana Jacobson has done over this past few months here, really, we have been able to automate more processes of TIP scoring. It's just that we've basically been sort of blown away by the very swift resurgence in project applications. And also, this is thanks in no small part to a lot of the proactive work that our partners over at MWRTA, CADA, and also the MBTA have done in getting fill-in projects presented and submitted and considered earlier during the application period rather than appearing in March as they had historically done. So there have been a lot of process improvements that have been beneficial for better automation of the scoring process that staff have delivered, though they've kind of been tempered by the realization that, yes, we now have more projects. We need to automate further if possible, and staff are looking to explore that using either some of the new grant resources we may have or working with what we've already got, whatever
And
resources allow us.
Great, thank you. And one more question or request made to the chair of the Tipper, Mr. Chair, if I may.
Good.
And for me, so Ethan suggested me that folks attend the meetings to give us, in the next Tipper meeting, to give us input. It really helps me if I get that input beforehand, in some kind of written text way. So to the extent that you agree with that, Madam Chair, I can relay that request. I would appreciate it. Thank you. That's it.
Thanks. Jay Monty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Ethan. You always impress me with your ability to get through so much information so coherently. I still have something I could do as well as you do, so thank you. There's a lot to unpack here. I guess I've got a few comments. We end up in this place every year. This is obviously a more severe version of that, but it seems like it's more severe every year. So, but it seems like we're always in this place of deficits, a year or two out, holes to fill in the first year. And when I look at that chart, I don't know if you can go back to it, showing the FY 25 through 29 and the deficits and surpluses. But we're going to go through this exercise again, as we have in the years past, where we're going to balance all this out somehow, so that every year is showing, essentially all funds used in each year, no deficits, no surpluses. And I assume that we come here next year and, FY 26 will be, have more funds unused. FY 27, even though it's an $84 million deficit today, when we come here next year, I'm sure some of those projects will be delayed, and that if we balance that down to zero this year, we'll be looking at a surplus of funds in FY 27 next year. I don't know if it's possible. I think we've probably had this discussion before. If we were to leave this alone, right? We fill in the surpluses in 25 and 26 with projects from the T and MassDOT and the regional transit authorities, like we always do. But we leave some of that deficit 27 and 28. It seems like we'll come back next year and that deficit will decrease simply by the fact that projects won't be ready. Is that possible? Are we allowed to do that?
Every TIP scenario must be fiscally constrained across all years of the TIP. So we are not allowed to adopt a TIP that has a deficit in any year. So the short answer is no.
So no. Okay. I think it's frustrating because we know what's going to happen, right? We know that we're going to balance it this year. Next year it'll be a surplus, and we'll be scrambling likely to fill it. But okay, it is what it is. I really did appreciate your analysis on the 25% design submissions. That was something that I was on the committee a few years ago, was a strong proponent of, just by the nature that you're further advancing a project before you're putting a cost estimate to it and a schedule to it, I think is valuable. It seems like that has turned out to be true. So again, very, very happy to see that. when we get into cost and project removal and even to some extent readiness, one thing I was critical of when I was on that committee a few years ago was this notion that we're placing the blame squarely on the project proponents, when in fact there are a lot of outside factors that lead to cost increases and project readiness. Project readiness can be a federal permit that is held up. It could be a change in state policy or state permit. A good example of cost, I believe, a few years ago, I recall there's a big change in how the state handles disposal of contaminated soil, right? And this is from a incident over in Chelsea on Route 1 where some soil was stored in a highway median and it turned out to have asbestos, and there's a whole change in policy around that, and that drove costs significantly for all projects, if I'm correct. And so it's not to blame anybody and say that that policy change was wrong or somebody is to blame, but I think it doesn't square with the idea that we're going to punish the project proponent when that proponent often isn't responsible for that cost increase. They weren't coming out and changing the scope of their project, but they were subject to changes in policy. So when we talk about project removal, I want to be mindful that we, like it or not, are a political body here, right? We all represent mayors and city managers, and that's a really touchy subject, particularly when I think it's easy to argue that many of these readiness and cost issues are not squarely to blame by on the proponents. So I just want to give that context. I hope we don't have to remove anybody's project. I hope we can figure out a way to keep everybody in here somehow. But again, those are my thoughts, and thank you, Ethan, for your presentation.
Jen? You're muted. You're muted, Jen.
There you go. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Ethan, for this presentation, for the one to Tipper earlier. I think to address Len's question, I completely agree that it would be helpful to have, of course, we want information. We want, to Jay's point, like there are a lot of reasons why projects could be delayed, many of which lie outside the agency of the project proponent. It is also difficult to receive all this information at a particular meeting, in different formats. So I guess in thinking through kind of the type of information we may be able to reasonably request at this moment in time, I was curious if members would feel it reasonable to direct staff via a motion to request that project proponents that haven't had design updates in project info for over a year, get an update, share with us a simplified, updated design and project delivery schedule that would include at least 4 milestones, not all milestones, but one being updated cost estimates, and kind of encourage folks to have that date at least by the end of this calendar year, but let us know when they could expect to get us an updated cost estimate, when the 25% design submission is expected, when the 75% design submission is expected, and then an update to the anticipated bid date. Because I feel like at least that I think preparing a cost estimate can take a lot of time and work, and may not be something that every project, especially the larger ones, could prepare in time for some of the upcoming meetings. But at least a simplified schedule to at least help us understand where the project proponents feel their project, how it's going to be progressing, may help us with some of these decisions. So that I can, if it's helpful, try to put that in as a motion, but would first be curious if what other members might think of that.
Jay? You're muted, Jay.
I had a separate comment, but I I support Jen's thoughts as well. So I'll let somebody else speak if they want.
Why don't you just go on to your second
Okay,
separate
sure.
comment, Jay?
All right. So back to my first comment, which was about balancing each of the fiscal years. And so, we're essentially recommending projects be delayed out of 26 and 25, and that puts us in the situation that we're in for 27. Just as more of a theoretical question, if you were to not move those projects out of 26 and left them there, what happens, assuming that some or most of those that were, assuming not to be ready are not ready, but they're left in that fiscal year, what technically happens then? So they don't go to bid, they don't start, that money is there. I mean, what happens?
Yes, so that's a very good question that MPO staff have been wrangling with. There are 2 projects right now that are proposed for delay out of fiscal 26 into 27. They amount to about $48 million based on the cost estimates that are presented here today, where MPO staff are still having ongoing discussions with the municipality, or the proponent is working with MassDOT to see if they can stay in 26. One is the City of Boston's Boylston Street project, which is the one that I also mentioned earlier, has a highball cost estimate right now, so it may be lower. The other is the project on Route 3A for the town of Hingham. So again, that's about $48 million of that deficit in 27 that could potentially be resolved if the projects move into 26 and hold their position. The difficulty in that is that the recommendations to be delayed into 27, in the case of the Hingham project, which is the largest of the 2 at about $33 million, are based on a series of utility considerations and drainage permits that, if they are not successfully attained within fiscal 26, would then lead to a substantial issue in 27. So basically what I'm saying is, this year for the first time, we have seen projects be delayed out of 25 to 26. There is the risk that if these projects are not addressed as part of this scenario, that we're going to see this happen again next year. If you can kind of see what I'm saying. Last year, we didn't have the issue of 24 projects falling into 25. We now have this new problem. It may become a repeat issue if the board, or, and again, this is up for discussion at future MPO meetings, but there is a risk to keeping projects that are bullish to make a 26 add date in 26 at this time, especially if they have a larger budget estimate. And especially if the nature of the permits they're attempting to obtain may be difficult to obtain.
I guess my question is really, let's take that project as an example, right? So you leave it in 26 and you try your best to get that project done, but at the end of the day, you didn't get the permits, right? Are those funds lost forever if they're not used? What happens to those funds?
So as this board may opt to pursue over future meetings, they would likely be addressed sometime in the development of the 2731 tip development cycle. But given their $26, they would need to be addressed by a backfill, for lack of a better word, backfill tip amendment. Which is to say, it wouldn't be part of scenario programming. It would be a very tight turnaround tip amendment to quickly identify a fill-in project via amendment, rather than do so via a full scenario process.
Okay.
Which may mean that the projects are not scored. Again, this is all projection. This scenario, I will note, is fairly conservative because it does assume in several cases that projects that could, if things align properly and submissions are made on time and schedules hold and there are no comments or issues, that they may hold these add dates. But given how readiness trends have performed in recent years, this functionally, for lack of a softer way to put it, is almost a worst case situation.
Understood. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think you give a good example of a project there with drainage permit issues and utility issues, right? And so these are readiness issues that, again, I believe, fall outside of the project proponent's ability to change. But I'd be curious to hear from those permit granting agencies. Are there ways to apply pressure to those permit granting agencies to understand whether that permit or that utility can be, accelerated? Because I think if we're gonna consider, asking proponents to move it along quicker or to keep their costs down, we ought to really be looking at some of these other readiness issues too. Whether or not we actually have the ability to affect them, I don't know. but it seems like that's a pretty significant aspect of all this, and I'd like to understand it better.
Thanks, Dave. Before I call anyone, I have a question. Ethan, just on this chart that's up. Does this presume that there's a cascade effect? So if I'm looking at 26 and there's a $65 million delta, that $65 million has already assumed that the $24 million from 2025 has been reprogrammed into 26 or not?
Yes, it assumes that that 24.6 million is already reprogrammed 26. I'd also note as well that there's a cost increase already factored into 26 as well,
Right.
for
And
one
so
of
it's
those
the-
projects.
And so it's the same way in 26 into 27, right? Like if I, as an MPO member, decided, say, let's not fund some of these projects, let's actually take the hard choice to kick some out of the tip. That $84 million isn't necessarily $84 million, right? It's $84 million on the assumption that we're going to do what we've always done, which is, okay, you're not ready in 26, we'll just move you into 27, correct?
Correct, yes. This reflects all delay recommendations and proposed changes in the scenario.
Okay, cool. Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I want to say that I support what Jen has proposed to me, and I just want to make it clear, at least my motivation for having these updates. It's not to kick anyone out of the tip. I mean, it's really for us to understand the reasons, for the delays, and the cost increases, so that we can better anticipate what's going to happen, so that we can budget better, in the near term and the outer term years, because it's all about knowing, what to expect, so that we can prepare for that. So the more details we can get from folks as to why what is happening, and then and what they anticipate will happen, the better informed we'll be. So that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just note, again, Ethan, correct me if I'm wrong, just doing simple math, there's $95 million worth of deficit. And in the next two fiscal years, 29 and 30, there's $53 million of space. Just by math and by definition, projects are going to get kicked out of the tip. That may be deferred into 2031 when we get to 2031 or whatever, right? It therefore becomes a question for the MPO members of how do you pick and choose whose projects are secure and whose projects aren't. And that's what the whole discussion Ethan wants to have later in future meetings is all going to be centered around that. But just the math will tell you, unless it was possible to move projects forward, which it never seems to be, unfortunately, right? There's just a cascade that projects are going to fall off the tip. Aaron?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also would like to support Jen's suggestion for some additional information as we look to balance the budget here going forward. And do think that some updated schedules, and not necessarily the Mass DOT sort of fully detailed schedules, but major milestones could really help us as we're contemplating where projects may fit and projects that need to move. And also really thinking about those updated budgets so that when we're moving items, we really know kind of what, or have a better sense of what that bottom line is. So I support both of that. And I want to echo Jay's comments about both cost increases and schedule changes can be very much outside of the municipality's control. And Jay gave some great examples of cost increases that have nothing to do with changes in actual scope of the original envisioned project. But I also think there are today's 25% submission requires far more detailed engineering and time. And municipalities' projects can take hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to get to that 25% design submission now, and potentially 3 to 5 years. So I think that there's a lot there. And I think I just want to give these municipalities an opportunity to really share what their schedules are and what has impacted their ability to move forward and reach that 25%. Thank you.
Thank you. Sandy?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe Josh Ostroff is here from the T, our Director of Capital Strategy, and wanted to say a few words about how the TIP process has been going from our perspective.
Okay, Josh?
I believe Josh may not be able to unmute himself. If somebody could unmute him.
If he'd be able to raise his hand, that would be great. It's hard to find people in the list of participants.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much. Josh Ostroff, Director of Capital Strategy in the Capital Program Planning Team. Just a couple of quick points. I first just want to thank Ethan and Adriana for their availability over the past couple of months, anticipating that there may be opportunities to suggest amendments or other transit projects to the MPO. We've been really well served by getting a sense of what kinds of projects may be most suitable and how we can work together. So you may see some stuff in the future, and I just want to thank Ethan in front of his employer and all of you for his availability in this. Second is that when we consider these potential projects to bring to you all, we have in mind geography, your mandate to have a region-wide transportation, complex of transportation projects, and also sometimes the benefit that the MBTA we're fortunately in a position where we can anticipate which projects can be federalized, which ones are suitable for us to provide the 20% match, and how we can address some of the geographic equity concerns that I know you all bring to the table. So just to thank staff for the opportunity to work collaboratively with you and address these issues coming forward. And then we hope to, in the future, be able to persuade the MPO of funding specific projects on the merits. But that's not, of course, in front of you today. That's all I've got to say, but always happy to answer any questions. Should add, though, that I do have been at many MPO meetings in various capacities in the past, and I totally understand the concerns of members and municipalities and how to work with MassDOT to bring highway projects forward in a way that hold true to the original objectives, recognizing MassDOT's role and concerns in making sure that a project that they are intimately involved with does address a lot of their infrastructure and service concerns, but also off topic. So thank you so much.
So Jen, on your motion, can you just put it in I guess Jim, put it in the form of a motion so we can discuss it and know like who you're going to ask this of, what you're going to ask them, and what. I mean, I understand the detail is not the detail that MassDOT asked for, but I just need to know like what or the MPO probably needs to know like what the actual ask is and who you're asking it of, and what you're going to do if people don't supply it, I guess.
Great final question there.
Yeah, maybe if that's not part of the motion, that's fine. We should just all, as members, think about what we're going to do if people don't reply.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fair thing to be asking. I had not thought it through as part of the motion, but I can. My motion is that MPO staff request by March 13th, so that it's ready for the MPO meeting a week later from that. A simple project delivery schedule for all projects that have not hit a project info milestone over a year, and that delivery schedule will include dates for sharing an updated when the project would, or the proponent would share an updated cost estimate, when it would have a 25% design submission, a 75% design submission, and a bid date. I'll put that in the chat too, but also open to discussion, of course.
All right. So there's a motion on the table that hasn't been seconded yet, but we can take discussion or somebody can just second it if you're good to go. Lynn?
My hand's up to second it. And
All right.
so yeah. And,
So the motion has been made and seconded. Is there any discussion? Lynn, do you want to discuss your?
yeah, just a quick discussion regarding, what happens if they don't. Well, at this point, there's no penalty, if they don't. Other than we just don't have information in order to really, make decisions about them. And the less information we have, then the harder it is to favor their project vis-a-vis another project. That gives us more information. We have more insight. I think when it comes to enforcement, that could be later on down the line when we talk about the various interventions that Ethan mentioned. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, obviously, I'm just mindful of Ethan's presentation earlier of asking people to opt in rarely actually results in them opting in.
Right.
Lynn, I'm sorry, Eric.
Yeah, I think this is a low enough lift for people. There might be some projects where, they don't know. It'll be hard for them to say when a 75% design submission would come in, because if they don't have the 25 yet, and they need, feedback from MassDOT, but we can ask them to do their best. I think it's fine. Ethan, I would also, maybe in this communication, you could just encourage municipal proponents and their consultants to attend some of these upcoming meetings in case there are more detailed questions about the status of their projects as well.
Any other comments before we vote on Jin's motion? Seeing none, please call the roll.
David Moeller,
Yes.
Tracy Lenhart,
Tracy Lenhart, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Sandy Johnston,
Sandy Johnston, yes.
Tyler Terasi,
Tyler Tarasi, yes.
Sarah Lee. Okay, I'll come back. Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Hannah Switlikowski,
Hannah Switlikowski, yes.
Len Diggins,
Diggins, yes.
Jen Rowe,
Jen Rowe, yes.
Nayeli Rodriguez,
Nayeli Rodriguez, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kosis,
David Kosis, yes.
John Alessi,
Yes.
Aaron Shute,
Aaron Shute, yes.
Kayla Sauer,
Kayla Sauer, yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Wynn, yes.
Tom O'Rourke,
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
and I'll return to Sarah Lee or another representative of Massport. Seems like she might have left. Okay. Either way, that motion carries.
Thank you. Are there any other comments or discussion about Ethan's presentation today before we go into our next agenda item? Seeing and hearing none. Thank you, Ethan. Next item is a presentation of the MARPA funding targets. And I don't know whether this is Derek Cravat or Chris Klim first, but either one of you young gentlemen.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I'll go first. Start us off with discussion of financial information for the State Transportation Improvement Program. So you can go to the next slide. So yeah, we were asked to just share some information about how the funding information is set for the STIP each year. Those target numbers that Ethan had just shared in his presentation come out of this process. And so just to provide a little more information on how it's derived, how funding flows from the federal level down to the state and regional level, we're just sharing a few slides here that'll just explain that process. So to start, we just wanted to give some definitions. It's all based on what are called apportionments. So about every 5 years, there's a new what's called surface transportation legislation or reauthorization bill. This is something that the US Congress passes and provides federal formula funding for transportation projects for the next 5 years. The current one is, of course, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, also known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That was passed in November 2021 and contains funding for all 50 states between fiscal years 2022 through 2026. So as part of that bill, every state receives a number called an apportionment, among several different apportionments actually, and then combined into one overall number that we use to then distribute from there. But the apportionment that we're being given for federal fiscal year 2026, which is what we're of course planning for at this time, given that we're mid fiscal year 25 and we will start planning for the next fiscal year around this time, totals $858.7 million. And those are, and again, individual apportionments that then roll up into that number from the 9 programs that are listed in this list here. So, National Highway Performance Program, right? Safety funding, CMAQ funding, air quality improvements, or bike ped projects, right? So we get an individual apportionment for each of these programs. Those roll up into that 858.7 million number. And then we kind of take things from there. You can go to the next slide. So that's how the apportionment's established. Even though we have that number, there's a certain percentage that we're allowed to actually obligate of it. That's percentage is known as the obligation limitation. It's been around 90% or so on average, or that's what we're using to find this. So we actually take 90% of that 858 million number because of expenses that are taken off the top that affect everyone across the country. It's a nationally set figure. And then we also account for what's known as August redistribution, which I know we've talked about at this board many times before, but this is a process whereby if states do not obligate or spend all of the money that they are apportioned, there's a process for other states to request additional obligation authority to obligate additional funding beyond what is originally allowed. So we assume a $50 million August redistribution amount in the STIP every year. And just to be clear, this is not a new apportionment of funding. It just raises the limit on what we're allowed to obligate. So we actually still need to have apportionments in the given categories each year. Next slide. So this is actually how it looks with real numbers, right? So that balance obligation authority number, 772.8 million. That's 90% of that number I showed previously, the 858.7 million. That is actually within the surface transportation legislation. And this is all for fiscal year 2026. Again, we're planning for that next year. And so this is the amount kind of at a high level that we have, and we add the $50 million of planned redistribution. And then we end up with an $822.8 million number that is sort of established as what we're working with for this fiscal year. And that's all based again in that legislation, and we divide it from there. And this so it shows a little bit about how that gets divided. So we start with this category known as planning adjustments and pass-throughs. So we look at things like GAN's repayment, that's grant anticipation notes. It's federal funding being used to pay back previous bonds that were issued to pay for state-funded next generation bridge program projects. There's award adjustments, change orders, right? If projects are in the field experience changes that need to be addressed, we reserve funding for that. Metropolitan planning funding funds all of the regional unified planning work programs, and state planning and research is the sort of counterpart to that on the state level. MassDOT planning's sort of planning budget. Recreational trails, which is a unique discrete program that's funded in coordination with Massachusetts DCR. Safe Routes to School education is a subset of one of the apportionments I mentioned, transportation alternatives, that we use to fund our Safe Routes to School program. On the education side, these next two are just kind of leftovers from previous years. And then railroad crossings and carbon reduction are both, again, apportionments that we get that we put here because they are more discrete programs that don't flow through the normal kind of process for project selection. We kind of handle project selections for those pots of funding kind of separately. So we note them in this section of the STIP as these planning items. So that's the sort of first step, is looking at that. You can go to the next slide. So we take that 205 million for those items off the top, and then we look at this. So about 1/3 of the total 9-year mark funding from the previous slide is allocated to all 13 MPO regions. And so this is where you see that regional target number defined, right? So using the far left column there, the regional share percentage, this is a formula that was developed by the Massachusetts Association of Regional Planning Agencies a very long time ago, and updating it is at that group's discretion, but it's stayed the same for quite a while. We use that to allocate between the different MPO regions. So you can see for federal fiscal year 2026, based on the formula and the amount that gets divided up, Boston MPO is receiving, the $125.2 million. And these columns refer to the federal funding. The $102 million is federal, $25 million is the assumed state match for those, and then non-federal match. Sometimes it's local match, and then that gets rolled up into that number there. So you can see how it varies by region, right? The formula has population included, so that's factors in heavily. So you can see, right, the islands kind of on the low end, and then all the way up to Boston, of course, which is the highest. Next slide. And then about half of the funding from that first number, the sort of 800-ish million number, goes to highway programs. So you can see those listed here, right? These are programs with the MassDOT Highway Division, interstate pavement, safety, intersection, etc. You can see listed. And these are programs where program managers and others in Highway Division leadership, in coordination with us all and leadership at MassDOT, generally make decisions about projects to be funded. So you can see how these amounts shake out by each program. And of course, right, many of these program projects, of course, we list them all in the TIP. So, even though they're considered MassDOT Highway Division programs, they're nonetheless programming projects, of course, in regions, and you'll see those in the TIP. And right, many often get picked up in regional target. It's just a system as to who makes the final decision on those. So I think that's how we do Highway Division targets. You can go to the next slide. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chris Clem to quickly walk through how we do the UPWP financials.
Thanks, Derek. Good afternoon. Afternoon again, everyone. This is Chris Clem from MassDOT's Office of Transportation Planning. And I'll carry on this presentation with an overview of our financial guidance for the FFY 2026 UPWPs. You can go to the next slide, please. So I'll start by saying that PL funds are forward funded, meaning that we use the previous year's federal aid to fund PL contracts in the current year. So 2026 PL will be funded from the 2025 federal aid apportionment, just as 2025 is being funded with the 2024 apportionment, and so on. As you can see in the table on the screen, the total apportionment for 2026 is compared to the active year 2025. You can also see that the obligation authority for 2026 is 90%. It's consistent with 2025. Then moving one row below, we arrive at total federal PL funds, and that is the apportionment times our obligation authority. And then one row below that, we can see this amount plus the 20% state match. As shown in the rightmost column, the total PL funding change from 2025 to 2026 does yield a 2% increase overall. And in this final row of the table, this is the value of PL funds plus 5303 funds. And 5303 is apportioned by FTA for multimodal transportation planning. And this apportionment is combined with PL into one consolidated planning grant, which funds the total of each MPO's UPWP. But DOTs have not yet been notified of their 5303 apportionment for FY 2026. So at this time, we are keeping this amount level funded from 2025 at a total of $5,213,471. However, once the new apportionments are released, MassDOT will share updated financial guidance with the Boston region and all the other MPOs. We can go on to the next slide. So here we can see how the funding breaks down for each MPO according to the PL allocation formula. And that was developed by the Massachusetts Association of Regional Planning Agencies, or MARPA. So moving from left to right, we can see that about 40%, sorry, not about, exactly 40% of funds are split evenly across the 10 MPOs. And then 30% of funding is distributed based on the relative size of the population. And the remaining 30% of funding is distributed for relative size of urbanized population, that is using the 2020 decennial census numbers. In the next two columns, we can see the 2025 and 2026 5303 amounts with match, which again, we are assuming to be consistent until we receive updated apportionments from FTA. And the following two columns show the 2025 total funding against the 2026 amount. And then in the final column on the right, you can see the delta in funding between these 2 years and the amount of additional money each MPO can expect to receive next year. And for the Boston region, we expect the PL funding total in 2026 to be $7,630,612, an increase of $93,217 from FY 2025. I believe that's all we have on the PWPs. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Questions? Seeing none. Thank you so much. I believe the next item on the agenda is member items. Is that true? Are there any are there any member items to come before the MPO at this time? Seeing and hearing none. Can we get a motion and a second to adjourn? Please state your name for the record when making the motion. Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa, motion to adjourn.
Thank you. Lynn Diggins.
Leonard Diggins, seconds.
Thank you. Any objections? Hearing and seeing none. That motion is accepted without objection. See you all in 2 weeks. Bye, guys.